Have you ever had a loan go wrong? We're going to talk about Trevor Francis today. Actually, you probably know more about him than I do. Francis became famous back in 1971. Birmingham City were right in the middle of the second division standings late in the 1970-71 season. They were hosting Bolton. Over 25,000 people came out, which is pretty impressive, I think, for a middle-of-the-pack second division team. Francis scored 4 goals that day, turning him into an absolute legend. Birmingham City's fortunes changed. They ended the 1971-72 season on an 18-game undefeated streak and were promoted. They finished as high as 10th in the league in 1972-73. The next year, 1973-74, Birmingham City were almost regulated. It was a miracle victory against Norwich on the final day that kept them up. By the way, that was also the day Manchester United were famously relegated. Francis wasn't a huge scorer in his early First Division years. His scoring did seem to come around, though, in the second half of the 1970s. But Birmingham City stayed mostly around the bottom half of the table. In 1977-78, they finished 11th. That was their best finish yet. Francis scored 25 goals in the league that season to pave the way. And Francis really started to attract a lot of attention. He was 24 years old by the end of that season. He'd already made several appearances for England's national team. His future looked extremely bright. In March 1978, the Minnesota Kicks of the NASL offered £500,000 for him. This was reported in the US papers as nearly $1 million. Well, I told you a few videos ago about the old NASL going after the more experienced older players. Trevor Francis was an exception. He was being touted as the next Pele, and the NASL clubs were looking for the next big thing. The crazy thing is that the Minnesota Kicks had only existed since January 1976. They were originally known as the Denver Dynamos, but moved away due to extremely poor attendance. Well, and as you probably guessed, there's a story behind all of this. Freddie Goodwin, a former Manchester United star, was manager of Birmingham City when Trevor Francis started playing for the first team. Goodwin was both president and manager later on of the Minnesota Kicks. Alright, as you can see, there's an obvious connection here. Goodwin knew English football well. In fact, his teams in Minnesota were stocked with players from England. I'm not surprised that he wanted Francis. But that £500,000 figure really bothers me. I mean, Minnesota had respectable attendance for their first 2 seasons, sure. But even given that, £500,000 for one player strikes me as a huge risk for a team that hadn't really established itself locally. Seriously, £500,000 was a lot of money back in those days. I think it was also a little bit presumptuous, though, to assume that arguably the best young English Wonderkid would be happy to jump over to an American league that was really nothing more than hype at that point. Anyway, Birmingham City wound up turning them down. Other NASL clubs started making offers for Francis. In the end, it was the Detroit Express that brought him in on loan. The Detroit Express were brand new and had never played a game by that point. They were preceded in the NASL by the Detroit Cougars, who folded in 1968 after losing a reported $1 million. Detroit also had an American Soccer League team, the Detroit Mustangs, who played at a high school stadium. The Detroit Mustangs were so obscure that I haven't really been able to find any contemporary media coverage of them other than a few advertisements here and there. That's a really bad sign. I mean, if you can't get your team's name in the paper, you basically don't exist. The Detroit Express planned to play in the spacious Pontiac Silverdome, which sat over 80,000. Doesn't that seem a little bit ambitious? Ambitious or not, Francis took the offer and became a star in Detroit. He scored 22 goals in 19 appearances for the Express in 1978. He led them to the playoffs that year, where they suffered a heartbreaking second-round defeat to the Fort Lauderdale Strikers. Now, going to the playoffs wasn't necessarily impressive. As you can see here, just about every NASL team in 1978 made it to the playoffs. And honestly, that's classic American sports for you. Americans just love long regular seasons followed by long and tedious playoffs. If you played with the MLS and Football Manager, I'm sure you're quite aware of that. Now, you probably know the story about Francis from here. He returned to Birmingham City for the 1978-79 season. Birmingham City was absolutely awful in the early going. They recorded a grand total of 8 points from 24 matches on February 9th, the day that Francis was sold. Trevor Francis was sold to Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest. They had won the league the previous year. Clough bought him for the fancy total of £1 million. Well, so much for that £500,000 offer from Minnesota the year before. Interestingly enough, Francis's contract included a clause that allowed him to play for Detroit in the NASL in both 1979 and 1980. Alright, here's where I really need to interject. I have no idea what the managers were thinking here. I mean, Francis was basically playing year-round by this point. He played 42 games in 1977-78, then he played 19 more in the NASL in 78, and then it was back to England for 29 from 1978 to 79. That was followed by another 14 in the NASL. He also played for the English national team in this period, and when he was with Nottingham Forest, he was playing in the European Cup. I mean, the man never had a break. That's not good. In fact, you can find articles warning about this problem when Birmingham first thought of loaning him out to the NASL. He continued to play excellent ball in the NASL. But all that fatigue added up. And you know, the crazy part of this is that none of this really helped Detroit all that much. The Express drew an average of 12,194 fans per game in 1978. They did a little bit better in 1979, 14,058. Their home playoff games didn't come close to selling out either season. Yeah, then Francis injured his Achilles tendon. Now, I'm not a sports scientist, I'm not a doctor, but I've really got to wonder if the lack of rest didn't contribute to that injury. Francis did not return to Detroit in 1980 as planned. His career largely fizzled out after that, highlighted by a bizarrely violent moment while playing for Manchester City. As for Detroit, well, the Express brought in Argentinian striker Pato Margetic to fill in for Francis in 1980. Detroit somehow failed to make the playoffs in 1980. Attendance plummeted and the team moved to Washington, D.C. to replace the Washington Diplomats who had just folded. This new version of the Diplomats folded at the end of 1981 as the NASL's problems mounted. Detroit did field a team in the American Soccer League, but they folded soon thereafter. Well, and there you have it. It's a sad story, and in the end, nobody won. Francis got a lot of money, but he never got a rest. In fact, he wound up ruining his career. Detroit lost its team, a couple times actually. Clough spent £1 million on a striker who didn't score very much, and in the end, everybody wound up sort of forgetting about the whole thing. It really is a sad story, but I mean, then again, I'm not really sure what I should expect from a flash-in-the-pan league like the NASL.